The stagecoach groaned like a dying animal as it surrendered to the final ruts of the road. Through the dust-caked window, Clara Mae Thompson saw Dry Creek for the first time. It was not the gentle picture painted in Mr. Abernathy's letters. It was a scar on the earth, a raw gash of raw lumber buildings and muddy thoroughfares clawed out of the brown hills. Heat shimmered from the ground, thick enough to drink, and the air carried the metallic tang of the mines and the sour scent of unwashed men. She smoothed the worn fabric of her gray traveling dress for the 100th time, her fingers trembling slightly. For 3 weeks, on boat and rail and this bone-jarring coach, she had held on to the image of Jacob Abernathy as her guiding star, a quiet widower. His letters spoke of a small but sturdy ranch, of missing the sound of a woman's voice in the evenings, of a simple life under an endless sky. His handwriting was neat, his words respectful. He had sent the fare for her passage from Missouri without question, a gesture of faith that had felt like a lifeline. At 22, with her parents gone and only a younger brother to worry for back home, she had seen this as her one chance to build a life, not just endure one. The coach door swung open, and the driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked wrinkles, grunted. "End of the line, Miss." Clara gathered her small valise, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs, and stepped down into the oppressive heat. The station was little more than a shed with a leaning porch. She scanned the handful of rough-looking men loitering nearby, searching for a face that matched the gentle spirit of the letters. None did. They looked at her with a hungry, assessing gaze that made her skin prickle. She clutched her bag tighter and stood by the coach, trying to look purposeful, waiting for a man who seemed to be looking for a bride. That was when he approached her. He did not move like a rancher. He moved with the heavy, deliberate confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He was tall and broad, dressed in a black coat despite the heat, his face clean-shaven but shadowed with a permanent scowl. A heavy silver ring adorned his finger, and his eyes, the color of muddy water, took her in from head to toe, not with welcome, but with the cold appraisal of a man inspecting livestock. "Clara Thompson?" His voice was a low rumble, laced with an authority that set every nerve in her body on edge. "Yes," she said, her own voice smaller than she intended. "I am looking for Mr. Jacob Abernathy. Do you know him?" A slow, unpleasant smile spread across the man's lips. It did not reach his eyes. "You could say that. Jacob Abernathy ain't here, and he is not coming." He took a step closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "The name is Wade Murtry. I own the saloon, and I am the one who sent for you." Clara's blood ran cold. "No, that is not possible. The letters, Mr. Abernathy sent the money for my fare." Murtry chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "He did, on my behalf. Consider it a debt settled. I hold the note on his land. When I told him I was in need of a wife and saw his advertisement, we came to an arrangement. His debt is cleared. And you, my dear, are the final payment." He reached into his coat and produced a sheaf of letters. "See for yourself. All from you, addressed to him." He was kind enough to pass them along for my reading pleasure. She stared at the familiar envelopes, her own careful script now feeling like a betrayal. A wave of nausea washed over her. The words of hope and modest dreams she had poured onto those pages had been read by this predator. She had not been courted. She had been purchased. "There has been a mistake," she insisted, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not." He cut her off, his smile vanishing. "There is no mistake. You are here on my coin. You will be my wife." He took her arm in a grip that was painfully tight. "The preacher is up in the hills, tending to some fever. When he returns in a few days, we will make it official. Until then, you will be my guest." The word guest was a mockery. He half dragged her away from the station, her protests dying in her throat as she saw the way the other men turned away. their faces blank. No one would help her. She was his property now. Dry Creek was not a town of laws, it was a kingdom, and he was its king. His saloon, the Gilded Cage, was the largest building on the street, a 2-story clapboard structure oozing noise and menace. He pushed her through the swinging doors, into a haze of smoke and the stench of sweat and spilled liquor. The piano player faltered for a moment as all eyes turned to them. Wade Murtry's hand on her arm was a brand, a declaration of ownership. "Boys," he announced to the room, his voice booming with possessive pride. "Meet my bride-to-be." A few nervous cheers went up, but mostly there was a tense silence. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the filthy floorboards, her face burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical blow. He led her past the long bar, toward a staircase in the back. As they passed the end of the counter, she saw it, tucked into a dark alcove, almost hidden from the main room, was a cell. Heavy iron bars, thick as a man's wrist, were set into the floor and ceiling, and inside, slumped on a low stool, was a man. He was in chains. Iron cuffs bound his wrists and ankles, the chains between them heavy and rusted. His face was a ruin of bruises and cuts. One eye swollen shut, his shirt was torn and stained with dried blood. Clinging to a lean, hard frame, he looked up as they passed, and for a fleeting second, his one good eye, a startling, clear blue, met hers. There was no plea in his gaze, only a deep, banked fire of shame and defiance. Wade followed her gaze and sneered. "Do not mind him. Just another stray dog who needed to learn his place." He shoved her toward the stairs. "Get up there." The room he locked her in was small and suffocating. A narrow bed with a thin, stained mattress, a rickety washstand with a cracked bowl, and a single window that looked out onto a filthy alley. The lock on the door turned with a heavy, final thud. She was a prisoner as surely as the man in the cell downstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body rigid, and listened to the raucous life of the saloon below, a soundtrack to her despair. She had traveled 1,000 miles in search of a home and had found only a cage. For 2 days, she was kept there. A grim-faced woman brought her meals, stale bread and greasy stew, and left without a word. Clara could hear Wade's heavy footsteps in the hall, the way he would pause outside her door, as if savoring her captivity. She spent hours at the window, staring at the alley, plotting escapes that were nothing more than frantic fantasies. There was nowhere to run. On the 3rd day, desperate for a breath of air that was not tainted with dust and defeat, she was allowed downstairs. Wade was occupied with a high-stakes card game, and he seemed to enjoy parading her through the saloon, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He sat her at a small table near the back, ordering her a glass of watered-down whiskey she did not touch. "Be a good girl and stay put," he warned, his eyes cold. "This is your home now. Best you get used to the scenery." From her seat, she had a clear view of the cell. The bartender, a portly man with a sweaty brow, ambled over and tossed a bucket of dirty water onto the floor near the bars. "Thirsty, Thatcher?" the bartender mocked, his voice loud enough for the nearby patrons to hear. "Should have thought of that before you decided to play hero for that Lakota brat." A few men chuckled. The man in the cell, Thatcher, did not respond. He remained perfectly still, his head bowed, as if conserving every ounce of his energy and his pride. "Wade's boy was just having some fun," the bartender continued, polishing a glass. "And you had to put your nose in it. Told you before. This town belongs to Mr. Murtry. What he says is law. And what you did, that was breaking the law." Clara watched, her heart aching with a strange mix of pity and admiration. This man, Eli Thatcher, was in chains for defending a child, in this lawless place. That was the only crime that truly got punished, defying Wade Murtry. That night, sleep would not come. The sounds from the saloon were louder than ever, a symphony of drunken shouts and brittle laughter. Sometime after midnight, a sliver of quiet finally fell over the building. Driven by an impulse she did not understand, Clara crept from her bed. The guard who was usually posted at her door was gone, likely passed out drunk downstairs. She slipped out of her room and down the dark, creaking staircase. The main room was empty, lit only by a single low-burning lantern on the bar that cast long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the ghosts of the night's revelry. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor, until she stood before the cell. Eli Thatcher was awake. He sat on the floor, his back against the rear wall, watching her approach. In the dim light, she could see the hard lines of his face more clearly, the stubborn set of his jaw beneath the bruises. "They forgot to lock your door," he said. His voice was a low, raspy whisper, rough from disuse. "The guard is asleep," she whispered back, kneeling just beyond the reach of the bars. I heard what the bartender said about the Lakota boy." He gave a slight, humorless smile. "He was just a boy. Wade's men were amusing themselves. I could not stand by." "So they put you in here?" "Wade does not like his authority questioned. And the sheriff," he added with a bitter edge, "is on his payroll. This is Dry Creek justice. No trial. Just a cage until Wade decides what to do with me." She could see the dried blood caked in his dark hair, the raw chafing on his wrists from the iron cuffs. An overwhelming sadness washed over her, not just for him, but for herself. They were two sides of the same coin, both trapped by the same man. "My name is Clara," she said softly. "Eli," he answered. Just that one word. From that night on, it became their ritual. After the saloon fell silent, she would sneak downstairs. She brought him what she could, a piece of bread saved from her own meager meal. A cup of clean water she managed to fetch when the barmaid was not looking. She would set them just inside the bars, and he would take them with a quiet nod of thanks, and they would talk. He told her he was a rancher, or had been. Murtry had squeezed him out, using forged debts and the sheriff's muscle to seize his land, the same way he had trapped her. Before that, he had been a scout for the army, a life that seemed a world away from this dark, stinking cell. He spoke of the open plains, of sleeping under the stars, of a freedom so complete she could almost taste it on the stale air of the saloon. His words were simple, direct, filled with a quiet dignity that defied the chains on his body. In return, she told him of Missouri, of her family's small farm, of the cholera that had taken her parents. She confessed her reasons for coming west, the desperate hope for a new beginning, a hope that now felt like a child's foolish dream. Speaking the words aloud to him in the darkness somehow lessened their sting. He never judged her. He only listened, his good eye fixed on her face, his presence a silent, steady comfort in the ruins of her world. Their whispered conversations became a sanctuary, a small pocket of humanity carved out of the ugliness that surrounded them. During the days, she was forced to endure Wade's presence. He seemed to enjoy her quiet compliance, mistaking her fear for submission. He made her sit with him while he conducted his business, his hand always on her, a constant, vile reminder of her status. She watched him brag, his chest puffed out, telling stories of men he had broken and deals he had swindled. She learned the currency of Dry Creek was not gold, but fear, and Wade Murtry was the richest man in town. One afternoon, her education in his cruelty became brutally clear. A young barmaid named Rosie, no older than 17, accidentally spilled a tray of drinks on a high-rolling miner. The man was furious, but Wade intervened, stepping between them with a false, placating smile. He sent the miner back to his game with a free bottle of his best whiskey. Then, he turned to Rosie. He did not yell. He spoke in a low, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying. "What have I told you about being clumsy, Rosie?" "It was an accident. Mr. Murtry, I swear," the girl stammered, her face pale with terror. "There are no accidents in my saloon," Wade said calmly. "Only incompetence." And then he struck her. It was not a slap, but a full-fisted blow to the side of her head. The girl crumpled to the floor, sobbing. Wade looked down at her, his face devoid of any emotion. The saloon had gone quiet. Clara looked toward the corner where Sheriff Brody was sitting, expecting him to intervene. The lawman met her gaze, then took a long, slow sip of his beer and laughed, a wheezing, complicit sound. Wade looked over at Clara, a knowing smirk on his face, as if to say, "See, this is power. This is what I can do. This is what I can do to you." Clara's blood turned to ice in her veins. There would be no escape. There would be no rescue. The law was a joke, and decency was a weakness. If she was to survive, it would not be through hope, but through rebellion. That night, her meeting with Eli felt different. The weight of what she had witnessed pressed down on her. She had stolen a heel of bread and a small tin of salve from the kitchen. She passed them through the bars wordlessly. He ate the bread slowly, methodically. "He beat one of the girls today," she whispered, her voice tight with rage. "For spilling a drink. The sheriff just sat there and laughed." Eli was not surprised. "That is the way of this place," he said, his voice a low growl. "He breaks things to show he can—" Clara moved closer to the bars, her fear warring with a desperate need for connection. "How can you stand it, being in here helpless?" "Who says I am helpless?" he countered, his blue eye glinting in the dark. "My body is in this cage, but my mind is not. I am waiting." "Waiting for what? For him to kill you?" "For a chance," he said simply. She reached her hand through the bars, her fingers hesitating in the space between them. He did not move. Slowly, carefully, she touched his face, her fingertips tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone, brushing against the swollen, bruised skin near his eye. He was real. His pain was real. He flinched almost imperceptibly at her touch, not from pain, but from the shock of a gentle hand. She felt a hot tear slide down her own cheek, then another. They fell onto his skin, and she did not wipe them away. In that moment, he was not a prisoner, and she was not a purchased bride. They were just a man and a woman, two souls trapped in the same darkness. An unbearable tension crackled in the air between them, a silent understanding of shared suffering and a flicker of something more, something fierce and defiant. Leaning forward, she pressed her lips to his through the cold iron bars. It was not a soft kiss. It was a desperate, hungry press of mouths, a sealed pact in the dead of night. It tasted of dust and blood and a sorrow too deep for words. It was a promise of rebellion, a spark in the suffocating darkness. As she pulled back, she kept her hand on his face, her other hand moving swiftly. From the sleeve of her dress, she produced a small, heavy object. Its metal was cool against her palm. It was the key to the back storeroom, a simple iron skeleton key she had stolen from a hook behind the bar while everyone was watching Rosie sob on the floor. It was a long shot, a wild prayer, but it was the only weapon she had. His eyes widened slightly as she pressed the key into his hand, her fingers closing his around it. "For your chance," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then she rose, turned, and melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone in the cage with the cold, hard weight of hope in his hand. A new Clara emerged in the days that followed. The brittle defiance she had worn like armor was packed away, replaced by a mask of quiet submission. She learned to lower her eyes when Wade Murtry looked at her, to speak only when spoken to, her voice a soft, agreeable murmur. She began to serve him his whiskey, her hand steady, her expression placid. To Wade, it was the satisfying sight of a wild filly finally being broken to the bridle. He grew complacent, his possessive gestures becoming more casual, his guard lowering with every passing day of her supposed defeat. He saw a conquered woman, a pretty ornament for his saloon. He did not see the cold, calculating fire burning behind her vacant eyes. Her performance was a shield, a diversion created for an audience of one. Every night, long after the last drunkard had been thrown out into the mud and the lamps were turned low, the true work began. In the dark of his cell, Eli Thatcher would retrieve the small iron key. The lock on his cell door was old, the mechanism stiff with rust and neglect. His first attempts were met with a grating resistance that sounded, in the suffocating silence, as loud as a gunshot. He learned to work slowly, with an agonizing patience, his movements so small they were nearly imperceptible. He would insert the key, testing the tumblers with a pressure so light it was like a feather's touch, learning their secrets one by one. The faintest scrape of metal sent a jolt of fear through both him and Clara, who kept watch from the top of the darkened staircase. Her body tensed for the sound of a creaking floorboard or a drunken snore from the guard. Night after night, the only progress was the growing slick of sweat on Eli's palms and the raw ache of failure in his gut. Their whispered conversations deepened, becoming the lifeline that sustained them through the long, tense days. They were no longer just two prisoners sharing their circumstances. They were mapping the landscapes of the lives they had lost. Eli spoke of his ranch, of the way the sun hit the valley in the early morning, turning the grass to gold. His voice, though a hoarse whisper, carried the weight of that loss. "There was a girl," he told her one night, his face turned away from her, hidden in the deepest shadows of the cell. "Her name was Anna. Her family had the neighboring spread. We were to be married." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken pain. "A fever took her family in the winter. I was away, on a cattle drive. By the time I returned, she was gone. I was not there to help, not there to hold her hand." The shame of his absence was a ghost that had haunted him for years. Clara understood then that his defense of the Lakota boy was not just a random act of decency. It was an attempt to atone for a failure that was etched onto his soul. He could not save Anna, so he had to try to save someone. Clara, in turn, unburdened herself of the quiet loneliness that had pushed her west. She told him about her younger brother, Thomas, barely a man at 16, left to work their played-out Missouri farm. "He has my father's hands, but my mother's gentle heart," she whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. "I promised I would send for him once I was settled. I wanted to give him a better life than one spent breaking his back for dust." She confessed that the letters she had sent to the fictional Jacob Abernathy had been filled with more than just hope. They were a desperate prayer against the encroaching silence of her life. "I thought any life had to be better than being alone. I was a fool." "You are not a fool." Eli's voice came from the darkness, rough but certain. "You were hopeful. There is no shame in that." In his simple words, she found an absolution she did not know she needed. He did not see her as a naive girl who had been duped. He saw her as a woman who had dared to want more. Their fragile sanctuary was nearly shattered one evening. Wade had been drinking heavily, celebrating a crooked land deal that had left another family destitute. Clara was sitting at her usual table, feigning interest in a worn copy of a newspaper, when Wade suddenly decided he wanted more whiskey from the back storeroom. He pushed himself up from his poker game and started toward the back of the saloon, directly toward the cell. Clara's heart seized. Eli was on the floor, the key in the lock, his back to the room. She had only a second to act. She stood up, stumbling slightly as if unsteady on her feet, and intercepted Wade, placing a hand on his arm. "Let me get it for you, Wade," she said, her voice breathy, affecting a tipsy coyness that felt like acid in her throat. He stopped, surprised, and a slow, leering smile spread across his face. "Well now, look at you, eager to please." His eyes roamed over her, and he seemed to forget his errand entirely. "I knew you would come around." He backed her against the wall, his bulk trapping her. His whiskey-sour breath was hot on her face. Down the hall, she could hear the faintest metallic click as Eli, realizing the danger, carefully withdrew the key. "You have been a good, quiet girl, Clara," Wade murmured, his hand moving from her arm to her waist, then sliding upward to cup her breast with a rough possessiveness. A wave of revulsion so strong it made her dizzy washed over her. She wanted to scream, to claw at his face, to run. But she saw Eli in her mind's eye, saw the key, saw their one chance. She forced her body to remain still. She forced a trembling smile onto her lips. "I am just trying to be a good wife," she lied, the words tasting like poison. To sell the lie, to turn Wade's attention completely away from the back of the saloon. She did the hardest thing she had ever done. She leaned in and pressed her lips against his. The kiss was wet and sloppy, a violation that went deeper than his groping hands. It felt like a betrayal of herself, of the kiss she had shared with Eli, of the last shred of dignity she possessed. She endured it, her eyes squeezed shut, until he finally pulled back, satisfied. "That is more like it," he grunted, giving her a final, rough squeeze before turning and lumbering back to his card game, his thirst for whiskey forgotten in favor of his victory. Clara sagged against the wall, trembling, her stomach churning. She did not dare look toward the cell. She felt filthy, shamed, but a cold, hard kernel of triumph settled in her chest. The diversion had worked. Later that night, when she crept down the stairs, the air between her and Eli was thick with a new tension. He had heard everything. "You did not have to do that," he whispered, his voice a low, ragged growl of fury. "Yes, I did," she replied, her own voice shaking. "We do what we must to survive." He reached a hand through the bars, not to touch her, but as if to tear the iron apart with his bare hands. The rage in him was a palpable thing, a dangerous energy that filled the small space. It was not a rage directed at her, but at Wade, and at the chains that kept him from protecting her. A week later, it happened, in the dead of night, with a silence so profound she could hear the beating of her own heart. Eli made one final, careful turn of the key. There was no loud crack, no dramatic groan of metal. There was only a soft, buttery click, the sound of a tumbler falling into place, the sound of freedom. He pushed gently on the iron door. It swung inward without a sound. He was out of the cage, but he was not free. He stood in the shadows of the saloon, a man in chains with no weapon, no horse, and nowhere to run in a town that belonged to his enemy. Escape alone would be suicide. They would hunt him down like an animal before he ever cleared the hills, and he would not leave Clara. That thought was not a question or a debate. It was a simple, immovable fact. He would die in this saloon before he left her to Wade Murtry's mercy. He slipped back into the cell and closed the door, not locking it, leaving it poised for the right moment. When Clara came down for their nightly meeting, he showed her. The sight of the open door made her gasp, a surge of triumph and terror warring within her. "It is open," she breathed. "And we are still trapped," he said, his voice grim. "I need a plan, a horse, a gun, and I am not leaving you." She looked at him, at the fierce loyalty burning in his one good eye, at the hard line of his jaw, the revulsion she had felt from Wade's touch, the constant fear, the slow burning rage, and the desperate aching tenderness she felt for this man all coalesced inside her. It was too much to bear. She was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt and desire, a reckless need to feel something other than fear, to claim one single moment in this nightmare for herself. Before she could think, she was pulling at the cell door, slipping inside with him into the cramped, dark space. He reached for her, pulling her against him. The heavy chains between his wrists were a cold, hard reality against her body. His lips found hers, and this time there were no bars between them. It was a desperate, frantic kiss, a drowning man's gasp for air. It was filled with all the unspoken words, all the shared fears of the past weeks. She broke the kiss, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked at him, her hands framing his bruised face. The world outside this cell, Wade, the escape, it all fell away. There was only this man, and this moment, with a raw cry that was half sob, half defiance. She pushed him back against the wall. She hitched up her skirts and straddled his lap, the chains digging into her thighs, a cold, sharp reminder of their reality. His hands came up to grip her waist, his fingers digging into her flesh as their bodies pressed together, a frantic search for warmth and life. It was not gentle, it was urgent and raw, a collision of two people starved for a moment of genuine human intimacy. It was a claiming, an act of fierce possession in a place where they were both possessed by another. In the darkness of that cell, surrounded by the symbols of his captivity, they found a frantic, trembling connection that was more real and more profound than any gentle courtship. It was the first time in years either of them had felt anything other than utterly alone. Afterward, they clung to each other in the silence, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing slowly returning to normal. The reality of their situation came rushing back in, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. The shame and the fear were still there, but they were no longer isolating. They were shared. Clara lifted her head from his shoulder. Her eyes, even in the dim light, shone with a new, harder brilliance. "I do not want you to save me, Eli," she said, her voice low and steady. "I want to help you burn this whole place to the ground." He looked at her, truly seeing the steel beneath her fear. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a survivor. She was his partner. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "All right, Clara," he whispered. "Let us strike a match." They spent the next hour plotting, their whispers urgent and precise. A simple escape was too risky. They needed to control the situation, to create an opportunity on their own terms. The plan they devised was dangerous, a gamble that relied on Wade's arrogance and the sheriff's incompetence. "He thinks you are a wild animal," Clara reasoned, her mind sharp and clear. "We will give him one." The plan was this. In the middle of the night, she would scream. She would claim that Eli had reached through the bars and attacked her, tried to drag her into the cell. It was a story Wade would readily believe. His rage would demand immediate action. He would not want a dangerous prisoner like Eli held in his own saloon a moment longer. He would order Sheriff Brody to move him to the town jail. "The jail is a stone box," Eli said, thinking it through. "But the road to it is dark, and the sheriff will likely send his most useless deputies, both of whom will be drunk." It was their chance, an escape on the road, under the cover of darkness, with only 2 drunken guards to overpower. It was a desperate, foolish plan, and it was the only one they had. 2 nights later, they put it into motion. Clara waited until the saloon was quiet, until the only sound was the rhythmic snoring of the guard slumped in a chair by the front door. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs, and then she screamed. It was a sound torn from the deepest parts of her, filled with all the genuine terror she had felt since arriving in Dry Creek. Lights flared upstairs. Heavy footsteps thundered on the floorboards. Wade burst from his room, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of fury. He found her huddled at the bottom of the stairs, her dress torn at the shoulder, a detail she had added herself, her body trembling. "What is it? What happened?" he roared. "It was him," she sobbed, pointing a shaking finger at the cell. "Thatcher, he reached through the bars. He grabbed me. He tried to pull me in." Wade's eyes went to the cell, where Eli was now on his feet, clinging to the bars and snarling like a cornered wolf, playing his part to perfection. Wade's face purpled with rage. He did not question her story for a second. It fit everything he believed. "Brody!" he bellowed. "Get in here!" The sheriff, roused from a drunken sleep in a back room, stumbled in, buckling his gun belt. "Get this animal out of my saloon," Wade commanded, his voice shaking with fury. "I want him in the town jail, now." Brody, too drunk to argue or think clearly, nodded dumbly. He deputized the bartender and another one of Wade's sycophants, both of whom were equally unsteady on their feet. They unlocked the cell door, not with the stolen key, but with the official one from the sheriff's belt, and dragged Eli out. He struggled against them, spitting curses, completing the performance. They chained his hands in front of him and shoved him toward the door. As they passed Clara, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. It was a look of grim promise, a silent confirmation of their pact. Then he was gone, swallowed by the night, flanked by two drunken fools on the dark road to town. Clara was left alone in the saloon, her heart pounding, the echo of her own scream still ringing in her ears. The first match had been struck. Now, all she could do was wait for the fire. The road to the town jail was less a road and more a suggestion of one, a winding track of mud and stone that clung to the edge of a ravine. Darkness was absolute, broken only by a sliver of moon that did little to pierce the thick canopy of pine. The two deputies, reeking of cheap whiskey and self-importance, stumbled along, dragging Eli between them. They were careless, their grips were loose, their attention divided between navigating the treacherous path and passing a flask back and forth. This was the moment Eli had been waiting for. He used their momentum against them. As the deputy on his right stumbled over a loose rock, Eli threw his entire weight in the opposite direction. The sudden, violent shift caught the other man completely off guard. With a grunt of surprise, the man lost his footing, his arm flailing. Eli did not hesitate. He brought his chained fists up and around, a single, brutal arc of iron that connected with the side of the first deputy's head. The man went down without a sound, a dead weight in the mud. The second deputy, the bartender, stared in drunken disbelief, fumbling for the pistol at his hip. He was too slow. Eli lunged forward, a low, powerful tackle that drove the man backward. They crashed to the ground, the bartender's head striking a rock with a sickening crack. He went limp. Silence descended, broken only by Eli's ragged breathing and the chirping of crickets. For a moment, he remained still, the adrenaline singing in his veins. Then he moved with a frantic purpose. He found the key to his shackles on the bartender's belt and fumbled with the lock, his fingers stiff and clumsy. The chains fell away with a clatter that sounded deafening in the quiet of the woods. He was free. He took the rifle from the first deputy's saddle scabbard, the cold, heavy steel a familiar and comforting weight in his hands. He checked the action. It was loaded. He then turned to the horses. The logical thing to do was to take the better of the two mounts and ride south toward the border, and never look back. Put Dry Creek and Wade Murtry and the ghost of a woman with haunted eyes behind him forever. That was the smart thing to do. It was the survivor's choice. But as he stood there, the cool night air on his skin, a freedom he had not felt in weeks, the only image in his mind was Clara's face. He saw her feigned smile as she endured Wade's touch. He heard the genuine terror in the scream she had unleashed for his sake. Leaving her behind was not a choice. It was an impossibility. His freedom was worthless if she remained in the cage. He swung himself into the saddle of the stronger horse, not turning south, but back toward the faint, malevolent glow of Dry Creek. He circled the town, using the cover of the hills, his scout's instincts taking over. He dismounted in a thicket of trees overlooking the saloon's rear alley, the same alley Clara stared into from her prison window. He tethered the horse and crept forward, moving like a shadow. He did not have to wait long. The back door of the saloon creaked open, and a figure emerged, carrying a bucket of trash. It was Clara. In the dim moonlight, he saw the dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the way she held her arm protectively against her side. A white-hot fire ignited in his gut, a rage so pure and consuming it threatened to swallow his reason. Wade had hurt her. He had laid his hands on her as punishment for the ruse, for the escape he believed was real. In that moment, Eli wanted nothing more than to storm into that saloon and wrap his hands around Wade Murtry's throat. He made a low sound, a soft whistle that was more like the call of a night bird. Clara froze, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Clara," he whispered from the darkness. She dropped the bucket with a clatter and ran to him, stumbling into the shadows. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him. She buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his mind a maelstrom of violent intent. "He hurt you," Eli growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing. "I am all right," she choked out, pulling back to look at him. "I knew he would. It was part of the price." "I am going in there," he said, his hand tightening on the rifle stock. "I am going to finish this, right now." "No!" Clara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Eli, listen to me. If you kill him, what happens then? They will hunt you. They will hunt us. We will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Killing him is what he wants. It makes you the animal he says you are." "He deserves to die." "Yes, he does," she agreed, her eyes flashing with a cold fire that matched his own. "But not like this. Not with a bullet in the dark that makes you a wanted man. We have to do more than kill him. We have to destroy him. We need proof of his crimes. Eli, proof of the bribes, the men he has cheated, the way he owns the sheriff. If we just kill him, another man like him will take his place tomorrow. If we expose him, we give this town a chance to be free. We give ourselves a chance." Her words, spoken with such fierce, clear-eyed logic, cut through his rage. She was right. A quick, violent end for Wade would only be the beginning of a long, desperate run for them. She was not just thinking about survival. She was thinking about a future, a life. He looked down at the bruise on her face, and his hatred for Wade deepened. But it also cooled, hardening from a blazing fire into a sharp, focused point of steel. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice calmer now. "I heard some of the men talking about an old trapper's shack up in the hills by the North Creek," she said. "They say it has been abandoned for years. No one ever goes up there. It is our best chance." They slipped away into the night, two ghosts leaving the town behind. Eli led the horse, with Clara holding tight to his hand, her presence a steady anchor. They moved through the darkness for hours, climbing into the pine-scented hills, the sounds of Dry Creek fading behind them until they were replaced by the whispering of the wind through the trees and the cry of a distant coyote. The shack was exactly as she had described it, a small, sturdy cabin of rough-hewn logs, tucked away in a small clearing, nearly swallowed by the forest. It was derelict but sound. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood and cold earth. There was a stone fireplace, a crude table, and a rope bed frame in the corner. It was not much, but it was safe. It was a sanctuary. By the first light of dawn, Eli had built a small, smokeless fire. Clara, using a piece of her petticoat and water from the creek, began to clean the cuts on his face and the raw, chafed skin on his wrists. Her touch was gentle, her movements efficient and sure. As she worked, the tension of the past weeks began to slowly unwind. Here, in this quiet, hidden place, they were no longer a prisoner and a purchased bride. They were just Eli and Clara. He watched her, the firelight flickering on her determined face, illuminating the bruise Wade had left there. He reached up and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of the discolored skin. "This should not have happened," he said, his voice thick with regret. "It is just a bruise, Eli," she said, her eyes meeting his. "He has left deeper marks on both of us, marks that no one can see." When she had finished tending to his wounds, a different kind of tension filled the small cabin. It was not the tension of fear or desperation, but something deeper, a magnetic pull that had been building since their first whispered conversation through the bars. He stood up and pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a means of escape or an ally in a desperate plan, but as the woman who had slipped him a key and saved his soul. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not like their other kisses. It was not frantic or desperate or born of fear. It was slow and deep and searching, a kiss of profound gratitude and aching tenderness. It was a promise. She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body molding to his. They made love on the dusty floor in front of the dying fire. It was a raw and needful coming together, a physical manifestation of the bond they had forged in darkness. It was a fierce affirmation of life, a desperate, beautiful act of defiance against the man who had tried to own them both. In the quiet aftermath, wrapped in a threadbare blanket he had found in a corner, they lay listening to the sounds of the forest, their whispered promises for a future they could barely imagine hanging in the air like sacred vows. Their peace was short-lived. A few days later, Eli risked a trip to the edge of town, staying hidden, watching. He saw it tacked to the wall of the general store, a crudely printed poster with a poorly sketched likeness of his face. Below it, the words were stark and clear. Wanted, Eli Thatcher, for the assault of 2 deputies, $100. The bounty changed everything. Now, they were not just fugitives. They were a prize. Every down-on-his-luck prospector, every greedy opportunist, would be looking for them. They could not stay in the shack forever. Their new reality arrived a week later in the form of a single rider. Eli spotted him from a ridge above the cabin, a deputy from the town, moving slowly, his eyes scanning the ground. He was on their trail. Eli sent Clara into the deepest part of the woods, telling her not to make a sound. He circled around, silent as a ghost, the rifle feeling like an extension of his arm. He could have killed the man easily, a single, clean shot from the cover of the trees. But Clara's words echoed in his mind. Killing him makes you the animal he says you are. He waited until the deputy was in a narrow ravine, a place with poor cover. Then he fired. The shot was not aimed at the man, but at the rock just beside his head. Splinters of stone exploded, stinging the deputy's face. The man cried out, diving from his horse in a panic. A second shot from Eli kicked up dirt just inches from his scrambling feet. "Go back," Eli's voice boomed, echoing off the ravine walls. "You tell Wade Murtry that the next one will not miss. This is your only warning." The deputy, his face pale with terror, scrambled to his feet and ran, abandoning his horse, crashing through the underbrush like a frightened deer. Eli watched him go, then calmly walked down, collected the deputy's horse, and led it back toward the shack. That night, the reality of their situation settled over them, heavy and cold. They were living on borrowed time. As they sat by the fire, the silence between them was different, weighted with the understanding that hiding was no longer enough. "Before I came west," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "I was with child." Eli looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It was not a thing of love," she continued, staring into the flames. "It was a mistake, a moment of foolishness with a boy who promised me the world and then disappeared. I lost the baby before I even began to show. No one ever knew, but I felt so empty, so ruined. That is why I answered the advertisement. I thought if I could come out here, be a wife, have a family, I could fill that emptiness. I could become someone new." Eli reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His grip was warm and steady. "My best friend, a man named Sam. We grew up together," he said, his own voice low and rough. "He was hanged. When we were 18, he stole a loaf of bread to feed his little sister. The landowner wanted to make an example of him. I watched them do it. I stood in that crowd and watched them put a rope around his neck for a loaf of bread. That is when I learned that some men's laws are just a weapon they use to keep good people down. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped, the fire crackling, their two painful secrets laid bare in the small, safe space they had created. Her story of loss, his story of injustice. They were the raw, exposed nerves of who they were, the wounds that had shaped them. In sharing them, they forged a bond stronger than any chain. They were no longer just allies in survival. They understood the very soul of each other. "We cannot stay here," Clara said finally, her voice clear and resolved. "Running is not a life." "I know," Eli agreed. "Then we go back." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "We go back, and we find a way to tear it all down. For Sam, for the person I wanted to be, for everyone Wade has ever hurt. He will have the whole town looking for us," Eli warned. "We will need help." A thought sparked in Clara's mind. A memory of a man she had seen on her first day in Dry Creek. A man shunned by the drunks in the saloon. A figure of quiet dignity who seemed out of place in the town's filth. "There is the preacher," she said. "The one who was away when I first arrived. The men in the saloon, they mock him. Wade called him a blind old fool. But they also seem to fear him. They say he speaks the truth, whether people want to hear it or not." Eli considered it. A blind preacher. A man who could not be swayed by the glitter of gold or the threat of a gun. A man who saw the world not with his eyes, but with something deeper. He was an outcast, just like them. He was the perfect, most unlikely ally. "All right," Eli said, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Let us go see a man of God." Market day in Dry Creek was a chaotic symphony of noise and smells. The usual oppressive silence of fear was replaced by the braying of mules, the haggling of miners over the price of beans and bacon, and the thick, greasy scent of frying pork from a vendor's cart. This was the cover they needed. They walked into the maelstrom not as fugitives, but as just another dusty couple hoping to trade a few nuggets for supplies. Eli had traded one of the deputy's horses for 2 outfits from an itinerant peddler miles back. He was now a stoop-shouldered prospector, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed, sweat-stained hat, a cheap canvas coat hiding his lean, powerful frame. Clara was his wife, her face shaded by a drab bonnet, her good dress covered by a plain, homespun apron. She carried a basket on her arm and kept her eyes downcast, the very picture of a weary, subservient woman. They walked with a slight distance between them, a portrait of a marriage worn down by hardship, a disguise far more effective than any mask. Everywhere they looked, they saw Eli's face staring back at them from the wanted posters tacked to posts and storefronts. The crude drawing was a caricature, but the name was clear. Clara could feel the gazes of men sliding over them, a casual assessment that turned her blood to ice. But no one looked twice. They were invisible, lost in the sea of desperate faces that washed through Dry Creek on market day. They found the preacher's tent on the edge of the main thoroughfare, a small canvas structure with a simple wooden cross driven into the ground outside. A hand-painted sign read, "All are welcome in the sight of God." Clara took a deep breath, handed her basket to Eli, and stepped inside. The preacher sat on a simple stool, his back to the entrance. He was older than Clara had imagined, with a fringe of white hair and a face etched with lines of both sorrow and peace. His eyes, clouded over with the milky white of blindness, were turned toward the canvas wall, but his head tilted as she entered, as if he were listening to the quality of her silence. "The Lord offers solace to all who seek it," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone, a stark contrast to the town's usual rasping tones. "I am not seeking solace. Preacher," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper. "I am seeking justice." He turned then, his sightless eyes seeming to find her in the dim light. "Ah," he said softly, "a much rarer commodity. I know your voice. You are the young woman Mr. Murtry intends to wed. I remember the fear in your heart the day you arrived. It has a different timbre now. It has been sharpened into a weapon." Clara was taken aback by his perception. "You are right," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He did not court me. He bought me. The letters I received, the ones that brought me here, were a lie. I have them." She reached into her dress and produced the small bundle of letters from the real Jacob Abernathy, the ones Wade had so foolishly shown her as a sign of his power. "Wade Murtry used this man's debt to trap me. He has committed fraud. He has stolen my life." The preacher was silent for a long moment, his head bowed as if in prayer. "Wade Murtry's sins are a shadow that has fallen over this entire town," he said finally. "He preys on the weak and calls it business. He buys the law and calls it order. But to expose a man like that is to invite a whirlwind." "The whirlwind is already here," Clara insisted. "It lives in his saloon. It beats women for spilling drinks. It puts innocent men in chains." She took a step closer. "I am asking you to be the voice of the truth. On Sunday, when the whole town is listening, I want you to read these letters from your pulpit. Read the words of the gentle man I was supposed to marry. And then read the truth of how Wade Murtry twisted them into a cage for me." He considered her request, his long, slender fingers steepled before him. To do so would be to declare war on him. "A war has already been declared on us," Clara said, her voice ringing with conviction. "On every decent person in this town. The only question is whether we will fight back." A slow, sad smile touched the preacher's lips. "So be it," he said. "Give me the letters. God has seen fit to take my eyes, but he has left me my voice. I will use it." While Clara secured their alliance, Eli slipped around to the back of the gilded cage. The market day chaos was the perfect distraction. Delivery wagons came and went, and the saloon's 2 back doors were propped open to vent the oppressive heat. He pulled his hat down low and walked in behind 2 men carrying a barrel of beer. Just another faceless laborer. He knew his destination, Wade's office on the 2nd floor. He took the back stairs, the ones used by the barmaids, his steps silent and sure. The hallway was empty. He reached the office door and found it unlocked. Wade's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He did not believe anyone in Dry Creek would dare to cross him. The office was a reflection of the man. A heavy oak desk, a leather chair, and a cabinet filled with expensive whiskey. It was the room of a king holding court in a kingdom of mud. Eli moved quickly, his eyes scanning for anything that could be used as proof. He rifled through the desk drawers, land deeds, loan papers, all of it predatory, but not explicitly illegal. He was about to give up when his fingers brushed against a false bottom in the deepest drawer. He pried it open. Beneath it lay a thick, leather-bound journal. He opened it. It was not a personal diary, but a ledger of corruption, written in Wade's precise, arrogant hand. The entries were damning. Page after page detailed payoffs and threats. "Sheriff Brody, $50. For silence regarding the Abernathy land deal. Judge Miller, $100. For a swift and unquestioned verdict on Thatcher." There were notes on minors he had cheated at cards, debts he had used as leverage to seize claims, and a chillingly casual entry about a payment to a man to ensure the O'Malley wagon had an accident before it reached the assayer's office. This was it. This was the weapon they needed. This journal could not just destroy Wade. It could tear down his entire rotten empire. He tucked the ledger inside his canvas coat, the weight of it both a burden and a promise. As he turned to leave, he heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. He froze. There was nowhere to hide. He flattened himself into the small alcove behind the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Wade Murtry entered the room, followed by Sheriff Brody. "I tell you, Brody! The girl is acting peculiar," Wade was saying, his voice a low growl. "Ever since Thatcher escaped. She is too quiet, too obedient. It is not natural. She is probably just scared. Wade," the sheriff said placatingly, "you broke her spirit, is all." "Maybe," Wade grunted, unconvinced. Or maybe she is smarter than I gave her credit for. Keep an eye on her. And I want more men out looking for Thatcher. Double the bounty. I want his head on a spike in front of this saloon by the end of the week. Eli held his breath, the heavy leather of the journal digging into his ribs. After what felt like an eternity, the two men left, their footsteps receding down the hall. Eli slipped out of the office and down the back stairs, his escape a blur of adrenaline. He had the proof. Now, he just had to get them both out of Dry Creek alive. That night, their plan fell apart. Clara had arranged to meet Eli at the edge of town after dark. She was making her way through the alley behind the saloon when a hand clamped over her mouth and an arm of steel wrapped around her waist. "Going somewhere?" Wade's voice whispered in her ear, cold and venomous. He dragged her back inside, not to her room, but to his office. He threw her into the chair, his face a mask of triumphant fury. On his desk lay a single, familiar object, the drab bonnet she had worn as her disguise. "One of my men saw you," he hissed. "Talking to that blind old fool. Saw your prospector husband waiting for you. A clever little plan. Did you really think you could deceive me? Did you think I would not find out?" Clara stared back at him, the pretense of submission gone, her eyes blazing with a hatred she no longer tried to hide. The sight of her defiance seemed to enrage him further. "You belong to me," he snarled, grabbing a fistful of her hair and forcing her head back. "I paid for you, and I will teach you the price of betraying me." He did not take her to the cell in the saloon. That was too public. Instead, he dragged her down a steep, narrow flight of stairs into the cellar. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of spilled whiskey and damp earth. He shoved her toward a heavy support beam in the center of the room. A length of chain and a heavy iron manacle were bolted to the wood. He snapped the cuff around her wrist, the cold metal biting into her skin. "You wanted to be with your shackled man so badly," he spat, his face inches from hers. "Now you can see how it feels. At dawn, I am going to bring the whole town down here. I am going to show them what happens to a woman who forgets her place. I am going to make an example of you that no one in Dry Creek will ever forget." He turned and stormed up the stairs, leaving her alone in the chilling, absolute darkness. Eli waited for an hour, then two. A cold dread, heavier than any he had ever known, settled in his gut. She was not coming. He knew, with a certainty that was like a physical blow, that Wade had her. Frantic, he raced to the only place he could go, the preacher's tent. He burst in, the journal clutched in his hand. "He has her," he said, his voice ragged with desperation. "Wade has Clara." The preacher, who had been sitting in quiet contemplation, rose to his feet. "Calm yourself, son," he said, his voice a steady anchor in Eli's storm of panic. "Rage will not help her. We need a plan." "There is no time for a plan," Eli exploded. "He will kill her." "Then we will not give him the chance," the preacher said, his voice hardening with resolve. He took the journal from Eli's hand. "This is our weapon, but a weapon is useless without an army, no matter how small." The preacher led him through the darkened, sleeping town, not to the homes of the miners or the merchants, but to the shacks and lean-tos on the edge of town, the places where the forgotten people lived. Their first stop was a small, tidy cabin. The preacher knocked. The door opened a crack, revealing the face of the young barmaid, Rosie. Her eyes were wide with fear when she saw Eli, but she looked at the preacher with trust. "Wade has taken Clara," the preacher said simply. "He means to make a public spectacle of her at dawn. We mean to stop him." Rosie looked at the fading bruise on her own arm, a permanent reminder of Wade's cruelty. Her fear was overcome by a simmering rage. "What do you need?" she asked. They went from door to door. They gathered a widow whose husband had died in a suspicious mine collapse shortly after arguing with Wade. They found 2 miners Wade had cheated out of their claim. They enlisted the liveryman whose best horse Wade had commandeered and ridden to death. It was a small, ragtag group, an army of the abused and dispossessed, armed with little more than desperation and a shared hatred. "We cannot face his men head-on," Eli said, his mind racing, the scout in him taking over. "We need a diversion, something to draw them out, to split them up." It was the preacher who provided the answer. "In the old days," he said, his sightless eyes looking toward the center of town, "the church bell was a warning. It meant fire. It meant flood. It meant danger. It meant the whole town should be in the square. It has not been rung for that purpose in 20 years. The plan was set. In the darkest hour before dawn, the town would awaken to a nightmare. A single frantic peal of a bell shattered the night's silence. Then another and another. A chaotic, clanging alarm that pulled people from their beds in a panic. At the same time, torches flared to life at both ends of the main street, casting wild, dancing shadows, creating the illusion of a town consumed by fire. Wade's men, startled from their drunken sleep, burst out of the saloon, pistols drawn, their eyes wide with confusion. They split up, running toward the flames, shouting in panic, leaving the saloon and their master vulnerable. That was Eli's signal. With his rifle in his hand and a cold, deadly purpose in his heart, he kicked open the swinging doors of the gilded cage. 2 guards remained inside, but they were focused on the chaos outside. They turned too late. Eli's rifle butt crashed into the first man's jaw. The second man went for his gun. But Eli was faster, a blur of motion, his fist connecting with a sickening crunch. Both men went down. He raced through the empty saloon, his boots pounding on the floorboards, and kicked open the cellar door. The darkness below was absolute. "Clara!" he yelled, his voice raw. A faint, weak response came from the blackness. "Eli!" He found a lantern on the bar, lit it, and descended the stairs. The flickering light revealed her. She was chained to the post, her face pale and bloodied, her dress torn. But as she lifted her head, her eyes were not filled with despair. They burned with an unbroken, defiant fire. He was at her side in an instant, using the butt of his rifle to smash the lock on the manacle. The iron sprang open, and she was free. She stumbled, and he caught her, holding her for a precious second. "We are not done yet," she whispered, her voice hoarse but strong. A heavy footstep on the stairs behind them made them turn. Wade Murtry stood there, silhouetted against the light from the saloon, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Touching reunion," he sneered. "But you are both going to die in this cellar." He leveled the shotgun, but in that moment, Clara moved. With a cry of pure rage, she grabbed the lantern Eli had set down. She did not throw it. She lunged forward, swinging it in a wide arc, smashing the hot glass and burning oil directly into Wade's face. He screamed, a high, unearthly sound of pain and shock, dropping the shotgun as he clawed at his burning eyes. That was the opening Eli needed. He charged up the stairs, a primal roar tearing from his throat, and slammed into Wade with the force of a freight train. They crashed backward into the saloon, overturning a table. Eli's fists were pistons, delivering a brutal, punishing justice for every bruise on Clara's face, for every moment of fear, for every soul Wade had crushed. He overpowered the blinded, screaming man, his rage a cleansing fire. The swinging doors of the saloon burst open again. Sheriff Brody stood there, pistol drawn, a look of confusion on his face. What in God's name is going on? He never got his answer. Behind him, the townspeople had gathered. They were no longer a frightened, scattered mob. They were a silent, determined wall of humanity, their faces illuminated by torchlight, their eyes hard and accusing. The preacher stood at the front of the crowd, his blind eyes turned toward the sheriff, the damning journal held aloft in his hand. "Your reign is over, Sheriff," the preacher's voice boomed, filled with a righteous authority that dwarfed any lawman's badge. "Your sins have been written down. We have all seen the ledger of your corruption. Sheriff Brody looked from the journal to the sea of hostile faces. He saw Rosie, the widow, the cheated miners. He saw his power, a thing built on Wade's money and the town's fear, evaporate into the night air. He did not say a word. He lowered his pistol, turned, and fled, disappearing into the darkness like the coward he was. His authority had collapsed, swallowed by the collective courage of the people he had so long oppressed. Dawn broke over a town that felt fundamentally changed. The air, usually thick with a stale, fearful silence, was clear and sharp. The chaos of the night had settled into a somber, watchful quiet. By mid-morning, nearly every soul in Dry Creek had gathered in the dusty patch of ground before the preacher's half-built church. They formed a ragged semicircle, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the man tied to a chair in their midst, Wade Murtry, his face a swollen, blistered ruin from the lantern oil, his eyes wild with a mixture of pain and disbelief, looked less like a king and more like a deposed, pathetic tyrant. The preacher stood before them, his blind eyes turned toward the heavens, the leather-bound journal held in his hands like a holy text. Eli stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms securely around Clara's waist, a silent, protective presence. He had cleaned the blood from her face, but the exhaustion and the lingering shadow of her ordeal were plain to see. "For years," the preacher's voice began, and it rolled across the square, a sound of profound and sorrowful authority. "A sickness has lived in this town. It has poisoned our wells of decency, choked our sense of justice, and demanded our silence as its tribute. That sickness has a name, Wade Murtry." He opened the journal. For the next hour, he read. He did not embellish or interpret. He simply gave voice to the cold, hard facts of Wade's own handwriting. He read of the bribes to Sheriff Brody, the extorted land deeds, the fixed card games, the payments to Judge Miller for verdicts rendered before a trial had even begun. He read the chilling entry about the O'Malley wagon, and a low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd as people remembered the good-natured family who had lost everything in that unfortunate accident. With each entry, another piece of Wade's power was stripped away, exposed as nothing more than cheap thuggery and calculated cruelty. The townspeople were not just hearing a list of crimes, they were hearing the secret history of their own suffering, the explanation for their own quiet hardships. They were seeing the architect of their fear, and he was just a man who was now bleeding and bound before them. When the preacher finally closed the book, the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. "The law that was bought and paid for has fled," he declared. "We are the only law left here today. So I ask you, the people of Dry Creek, what is to be done with this man? Do we cast him out, send him into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back? Or do we deliver the justice he has so long denied others with a rope?" The crowd surged, the murmur growing into a roar. "Hang him!" a miner yelled, his voice raw with years of resentment. "A rope!" another voice echoed, and the cry was taken up by others. A wave of collective rage that had finally broken its dam. They had lived in fear for so long, and now they wanted a release, a final, bloody punctuation mark to end the chapter of their oppression. Wade, seeing the murderous intent in their eyes, began to struggle against his ropes, his own fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Wait!" he screamed, his voice a desperate rasp. "Wait! I have gold! I have a safe full of it in the saloon. It is yours, all of it. Just let me walk away. I will give you everything." His final, desperate gambit was met with contemptuous silence. The bribe that had once been his greatest weapon was now a pathetic joke. His gold could not save him from the consequences he had wrought. The preacher raised a hand, and the crowd quieted, their angry eyes still fixed on Wade. "There is one among us," the preacher said, his voice cutting through the tension, "who has suffered at this man's hand more recently and more intimately than any other. The choice of his fate should not belong to the mob. It should belong to her." Every head turned toward Clara. She stood beside Eli, her small frame seeming impossibly fragile in the face of such a monumental decision. The weight of every eye was upon her. This was her moment. The town was offering her vengeance, a chance to see her tormentor pay the ultimate price. Eli's hand tightened on her waist, a silent message of support. Whatever she chose, he would stand with her. Clara stepped forward, away from the safety of Eli's embrace. She walked slowly, deliberately, until she stood directly in front of Wade. He looked up at her, his one good eye pleading, a film of sweat on his brow. He saw his life resting in the hands of the woman he had treated like a piece of property. She looked at him, not with the hatred he expected, but with a profound and weary pity. She saw a man so hollowed out by his own greed and cruelty that there was nothing left inside him. Hanging him would be an end. It would be a release, and he did not deserve a release. She turned her back on him and faced the town. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that it carried to the furthest edge of the crowd. "Let him live," she said quietly. A murmur of protest rippled through the townspeople. They had been promised a hanging. "Do not you see?" she continued, her gaze sweeping over their faces, her voice gaining strength. "Hanging him makes him a martyr in his own mind. It is a quick end to his story. I want him to live a long life. I want him to wake up every single morning in a prison cell, with nothing. I want him to eat stale bread and remember the feasts he once had. I want him to have nothing but time to think, and every day, for the rest of his miserable life, I want him to rot with the knowledge that he lost everything, to a woman he bought." A different kind of silence fell over the square, a silence of awe. They had wanted simple, brutal vengeance. She had given them a punishment far more poetic, far more complete. The anger in their faces slowly gave way to a grudging, then a growing respect. They saw not a victim, but a woman of iron will and profound strength. And so it was decided. Wade Murtry was not hanged. He was locked away in the very town jail he had paid for, the cell that had been meant for Eli, to live out his days as a testament to his own failure. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over Dry Creek. With Wade gone and the sheriff vanished, the town began to take its first tentative breaths of freedom. For the first time, Clara and Eli could walk down the main street in the light of day. He took her hand in his, their fingers lacing together in a simple, public declaration that felt more significant than any signed document. People nodded to them as they passed. Rosie, the barmaid, now running the saloon with the other women, gave them a wide, genuine smile. The town was not healed, not yet, but it had begun to scar over. Their freedom, however, was a fragile thing. The wanted posters with Eli's face remained, a constant, nagging reminder of the world that existed beyond Dry Creek. A new sheriff would eventually arrive from the territorial capital. New laws would be imposed, and Eli was, in the eyes of that distant law, a fugitive who had assaulted 2 deputies and escaped custody. Their quiet life was built on borrowed time. They did not speak of it. Instead, they focused on building a life. They abandoned the trapper's shack in the deep woods and found an old, dilapidated cabin on a small parcel of land by the river, a place no one had bothered to claim. It was a wreck. The roof leaked, the door hung on one hinge, and weeds grew up through the floorboards. But it had good bones, and the land around it was fertile. They began the slow, quiet work of making it a home. Eli, with a woodsman's skill, repaired the roof and chinked the logs with fresh mud and moss. He built them a sturdy table and 2 chairs. His hands, which Clara had only known to be gentle or brutally efficient, proving to be clever and creative. He would spend the days hunting and trapping, returning in the evenings with a rabbit or a brace of quail, his movements once again those of a free man in his own element. Clara, in turn, worked the land. She cleared the weeds, her hands becoming calloused and strong. A merchant, grateful for the end of Wade's reign, had given her a small sack of seeds. She planted them with a hopeful reverence, Corn, beans, squash. She was putting down roots, both literally and figuratively, in a place she had once seen only as a prison. The silence of healing began to settle around them. They worked side by side, often without speaking for hours. Their shared purpose a language all its own. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, eating their simple meal, the quiet between them comfortable, a balm on their wounded souls. One evening, a week into their new life, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl, and a cold, driving rain lashed against their newly repaired roof. The storm broke over their small cabin with a furious intensity, mirroring the violence they had endured and survived. Sometime in the night, Clara began to shiver. At first, Eli thought it was the cold, and he piled another blanket on her. But by morning, the shivering had not stopped, and her skin was hot to the touch. A fever had taken hold of her, a violent sickness that left her weak and delirious. For the next 3 days, Eli did not leave her side. The storm outside raged, but a more terrifying storm was happening within the walls of their small home. He bathed her face and her limbs with cool water from the river, his touch infinitely gentle. He brewed teas from willow bark and herbs he found in the woods, forcing the bitter liquid between her chapped lips. She thrashed in her delirium, her mind caught in a nightmarish loop of the saloon, the cellar, the chains. "The key," she would murmur, her voice a dry rasp. "Have to get him the key." Eli would take her hand, his own large and warm, and hold it to his lips. "You did, Clara," he would whisper back, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You did. You saved me." During the long, dark hours of the second night, when her fever was at its worst, he began to talk to her. He did not know if she could hear him, but he could not bear the silence, the sound of her ragged breathing. He told her the story of how she had saved him. He spoke of the first time he saw her, dusty and terrified, but with a flicker of defiance in her eyes. He told her how the cup of cool water she brought him in the cell had been the first act of kindness he had known in months, how it had been more potent than any whiskey. He described the moment she kissed him through the bars, a shock that had jolted his soul back to life. "You were the key, Clara," he whispered into the stormy darkness, his face close to hers. "Not just the piece of iron you slipped into my hand. You were the key that unlocked me. I had given up. I was just waiting to die. But you made me want to live again." On the 4th morning, the storm broke. Sunlight, clean and bright, streamed through the cabin's single window, and Clara's fever broke with it. She awoke, weak and drenched in sweat, to see Eli slumped in a chair beside the bed, asleep, his face etched with exhaustion. His hand was still clutching hers. She recovered slowly, her strength returning with each passing day of sunshine. The quiet between them was different now, deeper, charged with the intimacy of her vulnerability and his unwavering care. One afternoon, as she sat outside the cabin, watching him mend a trap, the question rose in her unbidden, a fragile tendril of hope for a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Eli," she began, her voice hesitant, "after Anna, did you ever think you would marry again?" He stopped his work and looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face. He did not answer with words. He rose, walked over to a small leather pouch where he kept his few possessions, and took something out. He knelt before her, taking her left hand in his. He opened his palm. Lying there was a simple silver ring, worn smooth and thin with age. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice quiet. "She gave it to me before she passed, told me to give it to the woman who was my true partner, the one who would stand beside me, not behind me." He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze unwavering. "I have never met a stronger, braver woman in all my life. Clara May Thompson." With a gentle, reverent motion, he slipped the simple silver band onto her finger. It was not a question. It was an answer. It was a vow. Tears streamed down Clara's face, not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. Their peace, so hard won, was shattered less than a week later. A stranger rode into Dry Creek. He was not a miner or a rancher. He was tall and lean, dressed in black, with 2 Colt revolvers strapped low on his hips. He moved with a cold, predatory grace. He went straight to the saloon and tacked a fresh, crisp wanted poster to the wall, right over the old one. The bounty had been doubled, just as Wade had ordered. $200 in gold, the bounty hunter announced to the quiet saloon, his voice like stones clicking together. For the head of the fugitive, Eli Thatcher, I intend to collect it. Rosie, her face pale, sent a boy running to the cabin by the river. Eli and Clara were mending a fence when the boy arrived, breathless, and delivered the news. A cold dread washed over Clara. The outside world had found them. "We have to run," she said, her voice tight with panic, grabbing Eli's arm. "We can pack what we need and be gone within the hour. We can go to California, Oregon, anywhere." Eli looked down at her, his expression grim but resolute. He gently removed her hand from his arm and held it, his thumb stroking the silver ring on her finger. He looked around at the small cabin they had built, at the neat rows of green shoots in Clara's garden, at the life they had started to carve out of the wilderness. He turned his gaze back to her, and the fear in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, unshakable calm. "No," he said, his voice low but firm. "I am done hiding." He pulled her close, his other hand coming up to cup her face. "This is our home. Clara, I am not running from it." He looked toward the town, his jaw set. "But I will die protecting you." The bounty hunter did not ride in shouting. He came at dusk, a patient predator moving with the shifting shadows. Eli had been watching for him, expecting him. He had sent Clara inside the cabin, the door barred, his rifle in his hands. He did not choose to fight in the open. He was a scout, a man of the earth, and he would use it as his shield and his weapon. He took cover in a rocky outcrop 100 yards from the cabin, a position that gave him a clear view of the approaches, but kept his own body shielded by granite. The bounty hunter, whose name was Fallon, dismounted and approached on foot, moving with a fluid, silent grace that spoke of a long and bloody career. He did not head for the cabin. He circled it, his eyes missing nothing, reading the story of the land. He was looking for Eli, and Eli was waiting for him. "Thatcher!" Fallon's voice was surprisingly mild, a conversational tone that carried unnervingly in the still evening air. $200 is a lot of money, enough to start over. It is nothing personal, just a job." Eli remained silent, his cheek pressed against the cool wood of his rifle stock, his breathing slow and steady. "I know you are out here," Fallon continued, his voice never rising. He had stopped behind the trunk of a massive pine, perfectly concealed. "I can track a snake over bare rock. You left a trail a child could follow. Let us make this easy. You walk out, and it will be clean. My word on it." "My life is worth more than $200, Eli called back, his voice flat and hard, giving away nothing of his position. A dry chuckle was his only answer. The waiting game began. The sun bled away below the horizon, and the world was plunged into a deep purple twilight. The first shot came without warning. It was not aimed at Eli. It was a shot into the cabin door, a splintering crack that was a clear and brutal message. I can get to her. That was the only provocation Eli needed. He fired, not at the sound, but at the place he knew Fallon would have to be to make that shot. The bullet ripped a chunk of bark from the pine tree, inches from where the bounty hunter's head would have been. The gunfight had begun. It was a battle of patience and skill. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness for fractions of a second, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing through the hills. Eli was a better shot, but Fallon was clever, constantly moving, using the terrain to his advantage. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Eli's head, sending stone chips stinging into his cheek. He felt a hot, searing pain in his left shoulder and knew he had been hit. It was not a clean shot, but it was deep enough to make his arm feel heavy, his movements sluggish. Inside the cabin, Clara heard the shots, each one a hammer blow against her heart. Eli's instructions had been clear: stay inside, stay down, no matter what. But she could not. She could not huddle on the floor and wait to see who would walk out of the darkness. She remembered his words, "I will die protecting you," and a fierce, cold clarity washed over her. He would die for her. She had to live for him. She unbarred the door and slipped out the back, grabbing the reins of the horse Eli had left tethered there. She threw herself onto its back, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, and rode. She did not ride away from the fight. She rode toward the town, toward the only hope they had. Her arrival in Dry Creek was a thunder of hoofbeats and a cloud of dust. She galloped down the main street and reined the horse to a skidding halt in front of the saloon, its new, hand-painted sign reading, "The Prospector's Rest." She threw herself from the saddle, her hair wild, her face streaked with dirt and tears, a look of desperate fury in her eyes. The people who had been enjoying a quiet evening drink turned to stare. She saw Rosie, the preacher who was sharing a meal with the new blacksmith, and a dozen other familiar faces. "A bounty hunter is trying to kill Eli," she cried out, her voice raw and ragged, but carrying through the room. "He is at our cabin, right now. He is alone, but he will not be for long. Eli is wounded. Please, you have to help." For a moment, no one moved. They were good people, but they were not fighters. They had families. The law was still a distant and uncertain thing. Clara's desperation turned to anger. She strode into the center of the room, her small frame radiating an intensity that made men twice her size shrink back. "Look at you!" she commanded, her voice ringing with a power they had never heard from her before. "You are sitting here, drinking and laughing in a town you got back because he was willing to fight for it, because he was willing to sit in a cage for it. Wade Murtry is gone because of Eli. Sheriff Brody is gone because of Eli. You are free because he showed you how to be. Is that freedom worth so little that you will let him die for it alone?" She turned her burning gaze on the preacher. "You spoke of justice. Is this it? Letting a good man be murdered for a bounty put on his head by a criminal?" Then she looked at Rosie. "Wade would still be beating you if Eli had not given me the courage to fight back. Are you going to let another monster win?" The preacher was the first to rise, his face a mask of somber resolve. "The girl is right," he said, his deep voice filling the saloon. "We owe this man a debt. A town is not just a collection of buildings. It is a covenant. We protect our own." Rosie grabbed a heavy iron skillet from behind the bar. "I am no gunslinger," she said, her knuckles white. "But he will not take him without a fight from me." That was the spark. The blacksmith grabbed a hammer. Two miners who had gotten their claim back thanks to Wade's journal rose and went to fetch their rifles. The liverymen, the merchants, one by one. The men and women of Dry Creek stood up. They were not an army. They were a community, and they were going to protect their own. Back at the cabin, Eli was weakening. The blood loss from his shoulder was making him dizzy, his vision blurring at the edges. Fallon was closing in, moving from cover to cover, a patient wolf circling its wounded prey. Eli knew he had only one or two good shots left in him. He made his peace. He thought of Clara, of the silver ring on her finger, of the life they had almost had. It was then that he heard it. Not the sound of a single horse, but the sound of many. A low rumble at first, then a steady, rhythmic thunder. Fallon heard it too. He paused, his head cocked, a look of confusion on his face. They came out of the darkness, a wave of determined humanity. The preacher was at the front, holding a torch aloft, his blind eyes staring straight ahead as if he could see the face of evil and was not afraid. Beside him was Clara, mounted on her horse, her face a pale, determined beacon in the torchlight. Behind them came the people of Dry Creek, a collection of miners, merchants, and women, armed with rifles, hammers, skillets, and a righteous fury. Fallon stared, his professional composure finally breaking. He was a man who understood odds. He could kill one man, even a skilled one like Thatcher. He could not kill a town. To try would be suicide, and it was not a part of his job description. He saw the cold, hard promise of death in their eyes, not for $200, but for something he could not comprehend, for one of their own. He gave Eli's hiding place a last, lingering look of professional frustration, a silent acknowledgement of a job left unfinished. Then, without a word, he faded back into the darkness, his footsteps swallowed by the night. His horse whinnied in the distance. And then there was only the sound of the wind and the crackling of the townsfolk's torches. They found Eli slumped against the rock, pale and bleeding, but alive. Clara was at his side in an instant, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the wound, her tears finally falling, hot and cleansing. The events of that night cemented the transformation of Dry Creek. When the new territorial marshal arrived a month later, he was not met with a cowering, corrupt town. He was met by a delegation, led by the preacher and the newly elected sheriff, a quiet, honest rancher named Thomas Bell. They presented Wade's journal. They gave sworn testimony about the corrupt Sheriff Brody. They told the story of Eli Thatcher, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had been unjustly imprisoned and had acted in self-defense. The marshal, a reasonable man who was tired of the lawlessness in his territory, listened. All charges against Eli were formally dropped. His name was cleared. He was, at last, a truly free man. They were married on a bright, clear afternoon, in front of the half-finished church. The whole town was there. The raw lumber of the new building smelled of pine and promise, a fitting cathedral for their new beginning. Clara wore a simple white dress Rosie and the other women had sewn for her. Eli, his arm in a sling but his eyes clear and full of a love that was breathtaking to behold, stood straighter and taller than she had ever seen him. The preacher's words were simple. He spoke not of God's law, but of the human heart, of its capacity for resilience, for courage, and for a love that could take root in the darkest of places and still find its way to the sun. When he pronounced them man and wife, Eli turned to Clara. He touched her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, a look of reverence in his eyes. Their kiss was long and deep, a silent story of all they had endured. It was the desperation of the bars, the urgency of the cell, the tenderness of the cabin, and the fierce promise of this new, sunlit life, all in one. It was a kiss that trembled with the memory of years of pain and a longing so profound it was a physical ache. As they finally broke apart, resting their foreheads together, Clara whispered the words that were the truth of their past and the vow for their future. "You are mine," she breathed, her voice for him alone. "And I will never stop slipping you the key." The town of Dry Creek began to rebuild itself. Honesty, fairness, and a slow, steady sense of community replaced the fear and greed of Wade Murtry's reign. The sound of hammers building new storefronts replaced the sound of breaking glass from saloon brawls. Months later, on a warm autumn day, Clara and Eli rode out from their cabin, now a proper home with a sturdy porch and a garden bursting with late-season vegetables. They rode to the top of a high hill, a place where they could see their small patch of land nestled by the winding river, and beyond it, the town, and beyond that, the endless rolling expanse of the prairie. The land stretched on forever, a vast, open promise. They sat on their horses side by side, his good arm resting on her shoulder. They were scarred, inside and out, marked forever by the darkness they had walked through. But they were free. Love, a thing that had been forged in the suffocating blackness of a cell, now burned bright and steady in the open sun. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.